Hi everyone, welcome to this revision video. The topic is about life in Elizabethan times. Today we're going to look at the idea of the Golden Age, we're going to look at different living standards and fashions, we're going to look at the growing prosperity of the gentry class and how they spent their wealth. We're going to look at Elizabethan houses, for example, and architecture, places like Hardwicke Hall. We're then going to look at Elizabethan theatre and its achievements and its significance and the different attitudes that people had towards the theatre. We're then going to also look at how Elizabeth portrayed herself through the various propaganda portraits that existed during this time, such as the Armada portrait, for example. So without further ado, let's go. So there you can see this is the outline of the key topics on life in Elizabethan times, which is the second main topic in the Elizabeth I course for AQA GCSE History. So this revision video is just going to focus on the idea of the Golden Age. So we're going to look at the gentry and the Renaissance, the fashions of the times, and then we're going to look at the theatre and also the court of Elizabeth I as well that was created during this time. So to understand the topic, life in Elizabethan times, it's really important to understand the concept of the Great Chain of Being. Now, the idea of the Great Chain of Being was that there was a strict hierarchy in Elizabethan England in terms of where people were placed within this hierarchy and how important the different people were. And the idea really was that people were fixed in their position in the Great Chain of Being, and particularly the ones at the top, such as the nobility and the gentry, didn't want there to be movement between these different layers of the hierarchy. So, particularly people like William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, for example, by his nature, a very conservative politician, wanted everybody to remain in the same position. So it's really important you understand this great chain of being. So right at the top there, you've got the Queen, and then underneath you've got the nobility. So these are the sort of the traditional powerful families in England. There's about 50 or so families. They own huge areas of land, traditionally been very, very dominant and very powerful, and had very much been integral to helping the monarchs in the past and also the present, controlling the country. And then underneath that, we have what's called the gentry class. There's probably around 10,000 families or so in Elizabethan England. And we're talking about the sort of wealthy people in society. So they could be knights, they could be lawyers. And some of these people in Elizabethan times became exceptionally wealthy. So people like Bess of Hardwicke, for example, is a great example of that. But there were more opportunities than ever within Elizabethan England for the gentry to exert influence and power. And we see that in some of the people that were within the Privy Council, people like William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, for example, who originated as a member of the gentry. Then below that, we've got the merchants, around about 30,000 families that lived in the towns that became wealthy through trade. And again, many in this class become very, very wealthy during this time, with the emphasis on trade, and that obviously links in with the exploration that goes on during Elizabethan times as well. And then below that, we've got the yeomen and the tenant farmers. The yeomen farmers, they own their land, and the tenants rented. And then below that, you've got the sort of craftspeople, labourers and servants, roughly about 500,000 families. And within that, you've got some of the very poorest in society as well. And one of the key features of life in Elizabethan times was the great divide between the wealthiest in society and, of course, the poorest in society. And what the duty of those higher up the scale in terms of the great chain of being, what the duty of those people was towards the poorest and less fortunate in society. So as we've seen, one of the features in this time period was that the gentry were becoming more powerful. Now, this is partly because the Tudors had actually made the nobility less powerful. You think back to the, say, 15th century, and there were people like Richard Neville, known as Warwick the Kingmaker, who exerted a huge amount of power and influence over the monarchy. And the Tudors, starting off with Henry VIII, had kind of almost tried to reduce the power of the nobility class. And so many of the important Tudor councillors during this time period actually came from the gentry class. So you look at people like Thomas Wolsey during the time of Henry VIII, but also, as I said, William Cecil during the time of Elizabeth I. This also ties in with Henry VIII dissolving the monasteries in the 1530s. That had meant that there was more land available to purchase, the power of the church had declined, and with farming becoming more efficient, it meant that the gentry were making more money. And that links into features in farming such as the enclosure of land, which meant there was less land available for the poorer people in society to perhaps grow a few crops or graze a few animals, for example. And it's very much a story of the wealthier becoming wealthier and the poorer becoming poorer. The gentry became more powerful through the trade and the exploration. You've got sailors like Francis Drake, for example, that are raiding Spanish treasure ships, and people are funding his voyages and investing in his voyages, like the circumnavigation of the globe in 1577 to 1580, and this makes this class of people very, very wealthy. And what we see with this, we'll see a feature of the gentry class spending more money. So it creates a new class of artists, musicians, architects and writers. And it leads to this sense that there is a golden age in Elizabethan England. For many people, I suppose, in society at the time, it would have seemed exciting. You've got the growth in things like the theatre, for example, as well, which we'll talk about in just a moment. People, for example, who are founding their own acting companies, so people like Robert Dudley, for example, get involved in that. And we see that in the wealth of these people that build these amazing, what are called prodigy houses. The wealthiest in society have always liked to show off their wealth, and if you are a wealthy Elizabethan during this time period, then you are building a grand house. So you've got these houses like Burghley House, the home of William Cecil, Hardwicke Hall, and many of these houses are built towards the end of Elizabeth's rule in the 1590s. There's plenty of other ones as well, like Montacute House over in Somerset. So lots and lots of spending that's going on during this time period, and this all adds this sense of this sort of golden age, this gloriana that's going on during this time. So the gentry, as I said before, they're spending lots of money and they're showing off this wealth, and they're using this wealth in things like education, for example. So the printing press is well established now, so people are buying books and having libraries in their own homes to show off their wealth. They're holding huge entertainments, big banquets, lots of food, hunting, trips to the theatre. The finest wines are being imported from places like Italy and France, for example. Fashion again becomes a status symbol. So fine clothes are being worn in Elizabethan times. You've got features like the ruff, for example, which gets larger and larger as we go through Elizabethan times, and that's a way of showing off your wealth. And then, of course, as I've said, the country houses with these great architectural ideas, some of them new ideas imported from places like Italy, for example, walls covered with tapestries, amazing fireplaces, huge sort of entertainments take place in these houses. And you think about 1575, for example, Elizabeth I goes on a progress to Kenilworth Castle, the home of Robert Dudley. She spends 19 days in a series of festivities and entertainments and events called the Princely Pleasures. It's a great example of how the gentry showed off their wealth and tried to impress people. Robert Dudley made numerous changes to Kenilworth Castle, including spending money on the gardens and extending the property to kind of show off his wealth. So that's what the gentry was spending all of this new money on. So here are some of the gentry fashions, and you can pause this and just have a look at some of the key features. But you can see some of the main fashions for a male and a female during this time. Some of them were common to both men and women during this time, like the ruff, for example. Laws were even passed to ensure that only certain clothes could be worn by the gentry. So this was a way of reinforcing that kind of hierarchical idea of the great chain of being, in terms of what you wore would say a lot about how perhaps successful you were, how wealthy you were as well. And these are some features of Elizabethan houses. So here's a little profile on Hardwicke House, for example, built by Bess of Hardwicke. Okay, a sort of actual title is at the end, Elizabeth Countess of Shrewsbury, and you can see there some of the different features there, and it's worth just being able to remember some of these key features. So, for example, you've got these large rooms on the top floor, long, large rooms, galley-type rooms, which will be used for dancing and entertainment. You've got the large glass windows, for example. You've got lots of ornaments. And quite often, if you would actually look at these houses from a sort of bird's eye view, they're also in the plan of an E shape, which again was a way of sort of marking a tribute to Elizabeth as Queen. And again, here you can see the grand house of Burghley House, which is built not far from the town centre of Stamford in Lincolnshire, where William Cecil grew up. So he built this house between 1555 and 1587. And this is a big statement, isn't it, of his wealth. You know, if you look at this house, it looks like a palace, it feels like a palace, and it just reinforces the power of people like William Cecil during this time period. Obviously one of the key privy councillors and the Elizabeth's first Secretary of State when she became Queen in 1558. This one belongs to Sir Edward Phelps, so it's Montacute House in Somerset, completed in 1598. You can see you've got that E shape floor plan, okay, and again very distinctive features there, lots of windows, for example, and again this was a way of you showing off your wealth. As I said, they're sometimes called prodigy houses. So London in Elizabethan times, it's interesting to focus on London as a place in Elizabethan times. The population of London grew massively during this time. We know that the population of Elizabethan England grew by roughly about 35% during this time period, which is a key cause for lots of poverty during this time. But London grows massively, 50,000 in 1520 up to about 200,000 in 1600. It's by far England's largest city. It's absolutely huge. Second city at the time is Norwich, probably got around about 12,000 people. So London is absolutely massive during this time. And this is an engraving showing a view of London in 1600 by Claes Vischer. And it's a very famous engraving, but it just gives us a really good idea about what London was like during this time. So you can see there's some different features. I won't read them all, but you can see some of those different features. You can see some of the key houses that are located in different places. You can see there on the east, say the St. Catherine's docks in London at that time. And you can see there that's obviously a hint to all the trade that was going on during this time. London was the country's most important port during this time as well. Nice little stat there, 93% of cloth exports went through London. And again, we talked about how there's lots of poverty in Elizabethan times, and lots of these poor people, they come to London to try to find work, and that's one of the reasons why London very much in this time is there's great wealth there, but also there's great poverty during that time as well. So one of the key features of Elizabethan England is the growth of the theatre. So the first theatre was actually built in 1576 by James Burbage, and imaginatively it's called the Theatre. I don't know how they came up with that one, but they did. And by 1600, most Londoners would be going to the theatre once a week. Now what's fascinating about the theatre is that all social groups can go, but it still reinforces the great chain of being. So what that basically means is if you're wealthy and you've got the money for it, you're going to be sitting in a better seat in a better part of the theatre than you are if you are poor, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. Now the theatres are located outside the city walls, so most of them are in the Bankside area in Southwark. In the south, and this is an area which doesn't have a great reputation. There's lots of taverns, there's bear baiting rings, for example, there's pickpockets in the area, there's brothels, and these are places which kind of divide opinion. So the theatre does become popular, but there's quite a lot of opposition to the theatre, not least from Puritans, for example, who are concerned about the immorality that's associated with the theatre, but also is concerned about the crime that's sometimes associated with the theatre during this time as well. So you can see that little timeline of when some of the key theatres opened. It's worth remembering about the Globe, for example, as an important theatre that was opened during this time as well. So there you can see another picture of London during this time, and then just a map of London's theatres. So as I said, most of them are located on the southern side of the river. You can see the Tower of London there on the map as well, but there were a few on the north side of the river as well. So one of the things to think about in terms of the theatre is that the design of the theatre showed how important they actually were, but also it reinforced the different social groups. Think about what we talked about when we talked about the Great Chain of Being. So if you look at the design of the theatres, they were basically an uncovered circular pit surrounded with covered galleries. And they were actually made to be quite similar to the idea of a bear baiting pit, so that if theatres, for example, were not successful, they could always be converted into a bear baiting pit, which was also a popular form of Elizabethan entertainment. Now, the plays always happened in the afternoon. There was no artificial lighting, so they always happened in the afternoon. Women were not allowed to perform, so it was boys that played the female roles. But the theatres, one of the key things of the theatre is that they were popular and there were cheap entrance fees, which meant that they were affordable for everybody. But it reinforced the social order. So the cheapest tickets were in for what was called the pit or the yard. And here the audience would basically stand just in front of the stage in very noisy, very exposed conditions in terms of the weather, for example. Okay. And they were known as the groundlings. Now, because the tickets were quite cheap and could just be a penny, sometimes the people were actually known as the penny stinkards, and this was probably a not particularly nice way of talking about how these people might have smelt at the time. If you had more money, you would watch from the galleries, for example, and you could pay a penny for a cushion, for example, and you would have a better seat. And the richest would actually watch from what were called the Lord's Room. So it very much reinforced the social order, the theatre in Elizabethan times. So some successful playwrights during this time, you've got people like Ben Jonson, Christopher Marlowe, and of course you've got William Shakespeare. Now the plays themselves would have captivated the Elizabethan audiences. They focused on exploration, some of the stories of, some of the sailors during that time, love, magic. We know that Shakespeare, for example, liked to write about the supernatural, violent patriotism. And the plays would have been a visual spectacle. So there were trapdoors, for example. There were dramatic entrances and exits. They would use things like pigs' bladders filled with blood to make dramatic stabbing scenes, for example. Okay. And it's interesting that we had the first theatre in 1576. And really before that, what theatres used to do, acting companies, they used to basically go around and they were acting companies and they would perform, for example, in village squares or at people's houses, for example. But the attitude started to change in the 1570s, and the theatre's becoming more accepted, and that's really interesting. And what's also interesting is that people like Elizabeth I realised that the content of plays could influence the thoughts of an audience. So we already talked about how in Essex's Rebellion, for example, just the night before the rebellion, there was a special showing of Shakespeare's play Richard II, which talks about a monarch being deposed. So there was a lot of thought that would go into what was the message of the plays. Now, the nobility would often like to get involved within the theatre. So people like Robert Dudley, for example, funded Leicester's company. We know, for example, that Elizabeth's cousin Lord Hunsdon formed the Lord Chamberlain's Men. So really, really crucial aspect of life in Elizabethan times, the theatre. Now, the original Globe Theatre was built in 1599, okay, and this was one of the really influential and important theatres during this time. It was a circular open-air theatre, 3 stories high, and it could hold around 3,000 people. And we know that this theatre actually burnt down in 1613 after a cannon was fired during the play of Henry VIII. But a modern reconstruction, which you can see pictured there, opened in 1997. Not exactly on the original spot, but not too far away. So this diagram just shows you a typical theatre, and it's just labelled up so you can see the different places. So that would be the balcony, and then you can see the galleries where the wealthier theatregoers would sit, the tiring house where the costumes were kept, there's the yard where the groundlings, the poor, stood to watch the plays. You've got a circular layout, so the audience surrounded the stage. Remember, that's linked to, they could convert them to sort of bear baiting arenas if they needed to. Now, the sort of below stage bit where people would come out from underneath the trapdoor, that was often referred to as hell. Okay, you got the stage there where most of the action took place. The theatre itself was only partly roofed, so the actors and the groundlings would get wet in the rain, but the wealthier people wouldn't. So that's okay then. So the theatre in Elizabethan times, there's opposition to it, partly due to fear of disease. There's lots of plague during this time. So the theatres were actually closed in 1593 due to fears of plague. There's a fear of crime. There's a fear that perhaps the theatre could be behind plots and rebellions. So we know about the Earl of Essex attending that performance of Richard II. And then religion. So many Puritans believed that theatres were the work of the devil, and that the theatre could serve to influence people immorally or distract them from their religious beliefs, and therefore many Puritans weren't particularly happy about the theatre. And then we've got censorship and propaganda in Elizabethan times. So moving away from the theatre, one of the things that I think is really important to be aware of is about how Elizabeth controlled the message during her rule. One of the most popular books during this time was John Foxe's Book of Martyrs, which was published in 1563. Now, Foxe was a Protestant, and his work very much demonized Mary I. And one of the reasons why even today people have quite a negative impression of Queen Mary I, and we have this whole idea about Bloody Mary, is partly from John Foxe's Book of Martyrs, and about how Elizabeth very much portrayed and her government portrayed Mary's rule in this very negative way, and at the same time served to show Elizabeth as this kind of new kind of ruler that would provide great hope for people. This golden age, very much this whole idea of Elizabeth stems from her own propagandists, really. There was a cult of Elizabeth during her rule with literary works. The theatre sort of reinforced this. People knew what Elizabeth looked like from portraits and from coins. There was a lot of emphasis on what she looked like, her clothing. Talked about the fact that she would wear a white mask to cover her face, so that it was quite badly scarred, her face, after smallpox in 1562. And we know she wore a wig as well. Any portraits that were produced of her that she didn't like were destroyed, or they would be burnt. So even if you hadn't met Elizabeth, many people would have met Elizabeth from the progresses that she went on, particularly in the South and the Midlands area. But even if you lived in an isolated part of the North during Elizabeth's rule, you would have known what Elizabeth looked like, and you would have had a sense of what she was like as a personality from that propaganda. So yeah, just finishing off there, we've looked at this before, but these are some of the key portraits of Elizabeth during her rule. So just worth remembering some examples of these, so you can talk about that as an example about how Elizabeth kept her power and control, and how she portrayed herself, or how her government portrayed her during her rule. Right, guys, so thanks for listening. I hope you've enjoyed that. So that's a revision video about the Golden Age. We talked about living standards and fashions, the growing prosperity and the rise of the gentry, the Elizabethan theatre, of course, and the different attitudes that people had to the theatre. And finally, how Elizabeth managed to portray herself and portray her rule as this Golden Age through censorship, control of the message, and through propaganda portraits. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.